All right, good morning, everyone. We are so glad that you have joined us for today's webinar. This is the fourth and final webinar in our Spring Produce Safety Grower Training Series. We're very excited about today's webinar. We have a very knowledgeable and expert guest presenter to walk us through a topic that is obviously of interest to a lot of you. We've got great attendance here today, and I'm sure that more are going to be joining us. We have a lot of content, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this beginning part, but I do want to just introduce our guest presenter today. She is Dr. Catherine Lindell, the Associate Chair for the Department of Integrated Biology and the Center for Global Change and Earth Observations at Michigan State University. She and her students investigate the roles birds play in agricultural and restoration contexts. She is the editor-in-chief of the journal Ornithological Applications, and she teaches courses in ecology and tropical biology. So when I went looking for a speaker to talk to us about the most recent research and effective means of managing birds in our agricultural environments, Dr. Lindell was recommended to me by several colleagues from around the country. And luckily enough, she was available today to speak to us. So this is going to be a really special webinar. Before we get started, just remember, if you're having any issues with the webinar, close other programs that are running. You can switch your sound. You can even call in if you need to. There was that information in your welcome email. You may use the chat or Q&A to type questions for us today. And following this webinar, we will be sending out any handouts or resources that are mentioned today. And if you've been attending some of our previous ones, we've got some others that are coming too. And just real quick, this webinar does not discuss COVID-related produce safety questions. So our goals for today, we hope that after participating, you will be better prepared to determine whether bird presence is a concern on your operation, identify the types of birds that are posing the greatest threat to your crops and food safety, and hopefully take action to effectively reduce bird damage and contamination of covered produce. So some of you may be on and are not as familiar with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule but this is the Food Safety Modernization Act. It was signed into law in 2011, and it gives the Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate food from farm to fork. It was the first sweeping regulation overhaul since 1938, so we were probably due. And what it does is it sets science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh fruits and vegetables. All farms, whether they're foreign or domestic, must comply with the produce safety rule and other aspects of FSMA where applicable. If you live in Idaho and farm in Idaho, then the Idaho State Department of Agriculture holds the regulatory authority for our state, meaning that they are the ones who conduct the inspections of covered farms, and they also verify exemptions. So that brings me to my next part. Not all farms are subject to the produce safety rule. If you are not sure if your farm meets the minimum sales requirements or the types of sales to qualify for an exemption, you can visit our decision tool link to help you determine coverage. And I can put that link in the chat a little bit later. It's an anonymous, self-guided tool that asks a few key questions and then tells you how likely you are to be covered or not. So we're going to be discussing some content that relates to very specific subparts of the rule. And this is subpart I, section 112.81a. This is the standards directed to domesticated and wild animals on farms which grow, harvest, pack, and hold covered produce. So these are produce items that are commonly consumed raw. These requirements apply when covered activities, meaning growing, holding, packing, harvesting, take place in an outdoor area or a partially enclosed building, and where there is a reasonable probability that animals will contaminate covered produce. It also goes on to talk about the steps that you must take. They're set forth in this paragraph. If under the circumstances, there is a reasonable probability that grazing animals, flying animals, working animals, or animal intrusion might contaminate covered produce. So these are some of the sections that deal with specifically with animals, both domestic and wild. And if you have a copy of the rule, you can look at this in more detail. You can ask us. If you've been through one of our Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings, then you have the rule and you have the manual that goes over a lot of what is required in the rule. We're really interested though today in animal intrusion. These are animals coming in uninvited into your production areas. So subpart 112.83b goes over that if there is a reasonable probability that animal intrusion is happened or is going to happen, then you must assess relevant areas used for the covered activity for evidence of potential contamination of covered produce as needed throughout the growing season. And if significant evidence of potential contamination is found, not found, you must evaluate whether the covered produce can be harvested in accordance with the requirements of section 1112, and take reasonable measures during growing to assist you during harvest when you must identify and not harvest covered produce that is likely to be contaminated with a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard. Now, this is the language exactly from the rule. And really what it's referring to is if you've been to any of our trainings, you've heard us say, don't pick poop, right? We are not to harvest any produce that has been contaminated or reasonably you assume to be contaminated with animal feces. However, right, there's not a silver bullet, literally. We also have to keep in mind that you are not authorized to take any threatened or endangered species, and you are not required to take measures to exclude animals 100% from your outdoor growing areas or to destroy animal habitat or otherwise clear all farm borders around your outdoor growing areas or drainages. So where does that leave you as a grower if you have animal pests that are a pest not only because they're consuming your produce potentially, but also pooping on your produce and making it unharvestable? What do you do? Where do you find that middle ground between preserving wildlife and preserving your farm's economic viability? So that's really going to be what we're focused on today. And I'm going to turn the time over to Catherine in just a minute. But I just wanted to go over really quickly what the observations from our inspectors have shown about how our Idaho farms are doing. So these are anonymous reports from their inspections. They're not going to be identifiable to any one farm, but these are things that have been happening on Idaho farms that have been noted. So our inspectors did find bird feces present in partially enclosed buildings that are used for covered activities. They also found feces present on equipment, tools, floors, and walls. So we're finding bird presence and damage inside buildings and partially enclosed, like packing houses or covered areas. Birds and birds' nests present in partially enclosed buildings used for the covered activities, so they're getting in. And then also bird feces present on covered produce during the growing or harvest season. Now, it's not a problem just that it's there. It's a problem if you're harvesting it or if you don't have a plan for how you're going to avoid harvesting it. And then also they have just found bird feces on covered produce prior to or during harvest. And when I'm saying covered produce, I don't mean covered up like with a roof or a tent or a net. It means that it is produce that is covered by the rule. So, any vegetable that is commonly consumed raw. All right, at this point, I'm going to stop my section. If you have questions specifically about the rule, go ahead and put them in the chat. We do have our ISDA regulators on the call here today, so we can answer some of those questions, but I want to give Dr. Lindell as much time as possible to go over what she's brought with us for us. So also, if you are on the webinar and you would like to receive your pesticide credit, you must be present until the end, at which point I will provide instructions for how you will get your credit using this virtual format. And again, we are going to be able to give you 1 credit for today. All right, I'm going to pull up your slides. And we're trying something a little bit new with Zoom, so I am going to turn the controls over to Catherine. I think we're good to go now.
Those little things aren't showing up yet.
Okay. How about now?
Oh, now they are. Okay. Okay, well, I'll get started then. Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to talk to people from another part of the country. So I'm coming to you from Michigan State University, and we grow some of the same crops you do, some maybe not as much. But so I'm going to be talking about some of the work we've done, in the last 10 years or so about bird management. And so this, first of all, is one of our sweet cherry orchards up in Michigan. Okay. All right. So what I'll be covering are risk factors and management strategies. Whoops. Oh dear. It seems to be going on its own somewhat, Ariel.
Okay, I think what's happening is I was typing in the chat and it was going crazy. Okay, I'm going to stop typing.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, this is what we're going to be covering: risk factors and management strategies. Whoops.
Okay, now go.
Oh dear. Okay, so these are just some examples of bird damage that you may have seen. So in grapes, of course, they can be a big pest. In apples, we have a lot of, we're, one of the top blueberry producers in Michigan, a lot of blueberry damage due to birds, and sweet cherries, both sweet and tart cherries. And of course, there's lots of other crops that are impacted by birds as well, and some vegetables as well, like sweet corn. So we did some economic analyses with some colleagues about 10 years ago now. But just to give you an idea of the scope of the problem, we interviewed 1,500 growers. We sent them surveys in these 5 states right here: California, Michigan, New York, Oregon, and Washington. And we asked them questions and then calculated some of the economic data with regard to bird damage. So what you can see in this column is the percent of respondents who were growing this particular crop, wine grapes, and then their yield per acre is here, measured in tons. So if you have any interest in that from state to state, this is what's really striking, is these are the annual bird management costs that growers said they were spending per acre. And so of course, wine grapes are really high value crops, but you can see they were estimating nearly $6,000 per acre to try and manage birds. And then we also asked the growers, what's your current level of bird damage? And so that's represented here. You can see it ranges from 3 to 9%. And then we asked them to estimate, if they didn't do any bird management, if they just let the birds do whatever they wanted, what would their loss be? And we asked them to estimate if they didn't do anything. And then we asked them for their high estimate if they didn't do anything to manage birds and if their neighbors didn't do anything either. And so you can see they were all estimating double-digit levels of damage. And so it's clearly a big problem in wine grapes. And then we also have similar data for sweet cherries and tart cherries in Michigan, apples, and blueberries. So again, with the sweet cherry data, you can see the current damage is really high here, especially in New York. We think that's because they have a lot of small blocks there. But out in your end, Oregon and Washington, 5 to 9% current loss. And so people are spending a lot. There's a lot of damage. And so it's an important issue that we're trying to address. So I'll go through the risk factors for bird damage first, then some management options, and then some other considerations like some of the federal rules regarding what you can do about birds. So here's some of the challenges of bird management, which I'm sure you're very aware of, but it can be really, the bird pressure can be highly variable across farms and across years. And we've certainly seen that in some of the work that we've done. So in some ways it's hard to predict, though we can get some kind of guidelines that might help you predict when and where you're going to get a lot of bird damage. Now, landscapes too are often a mix of agricultural land, residential land. Sometimes there's wooded areas. And so you've got this mix of habitat types that can provide a really nice set of habitats for birds. So they might roost, for example, in forests and then move into the crops to eat. And, so it's just a nice landscape type for a lot of species like robins that cause some of the damage. Now, some of the deterrents people use, like propane cannons and things, they can be annoying to your neighbors. And so, if we can find something besides that, that would be preferable. And then, of course, you've got, these are not like fruit flies that no one really cares about, but many people, including farmers, like birds. So things like widespread shooting, for example, are not going to be terribly popular. So there's that socially acceptable piece that you need to think about too. And I'm just going to give you a little more data here from our survey of growers. about how they perceive different bird management techniques. And what you can see, whoops. Okay, sorry. Very effective techniques were very rarely considered. Only netting was considered very effective over half of the time by the growers that we interviewed. And most of these techniques you can see were considered only moderately or slightly effective. And those include things like lethal shooting or chemical repellents, auditory scare devices. So in other words, we're still trying to find things to help us manage birds. Okay, and this is just to let you know that the data I'm going to show you are based on a lot of field hours. Here's a blueberry field in Michigan, and we had a very systematic way that we measured fruit damage. So we tried to measure fruit damage in a lot of different crops, and we also tried to use the damage levels to assess whether particular deterrent techniques were working. And so this involved, for any given block, we divided it up into 5 different strata. The edges, tend to get more damage than the interior. And then we randomly selected plants within these different strata, randomly selected a cane or a branch, and then counted the fruit and counted how many were damaged. Now with cherries, you can just go in there and see how many are damaged. Or if you just have the stem sticking out, you can attribute it a lot of times to bird damage. Something like blueberries, we had to go back in and count again. We counted all the berries, then went back in right before harvest to see how many were left. But so then we weighted these different strata to come up with a percent damage throughout the whole block. Okay, so the general principle number 1 I would mention is that when you have less crop, you're going to tend to get a higher proportion of bird damage. And so we'll talk about this in some detail here. So this was, these are some data that we collected when we were doing a lot of sampling in Michigan sweet cherries from 2012 to 2014. And down here, these represent different sites. So site 1, site 2, site 3, etc. And these are 3 different years when we sampled. And here's the number of fruit sampled here. And so what you can see in the Northeast and Midwest in 2012, it was a terrible year for fruit production in that we had a very late frost after it had started to get warm. So a lot of plants were damaged right at a poor time. So you can see that's represented by these, the blue number of fruits sampled was really low because there were so few fruits in 2012. And then you can see were many more fruits in 2013 and even more in 2014, which was a high year. So this is just to show you that the amount of crop really varied across these 3 years. And then we looked at, for those same sites, we compiled how many fruits were lost to birds, okay, and how many fruits were sampled. So for example, what this means is there were only 184 fruits sampled in site 1 in 2012. Of those 184, 33 were damaged or had been lost to birds, all right? And then in 2013, in the same site, there were so many more fruits. We sampled 2,703, but we only had 51 fruits that were damaged or lost. Then we had even more fruits sampled in 2014, but again, we're still at this same level of fruit damaged or lost. And it's about the same story in all these different sites. In other words, what it looks like is that the amount of damage stays about the same, but so you're going to notice it a lot more in years when you have a lot less fruit because it's going to make up a higher proportion of your fruit that's out there. So, in 2014, we sampled over 11,000 fruits in this site, only 46 were damaged. So it was really low bird damage year. So just to illustrate the point that in low yield years, you're often going to feel it more because it's going to be a higher percentage of your fruit. And it's borne out here in this graph. So here's the percent of cherries that were lost to birds in 2012, 2013, and 2014. And you can see 2012, we tended to get a lot more damage than in the other years, or a greater percent damage. Okay, and the same thing, we saw the same thing in our blueberry area, and that we got a lot more damage in 2012 compared to those other years. And we saw a similar pattern in wine grapes as well. Okay, so therefore in high yield years, the bird management, not only are you going to feel it less, but it's generally going to be less critical than in low yield years, except if there's particular bird hotspots and if you know where they are. But so, you know, when the bird management, when the birds have lots to choose from, there's lots of crop out there, you know, the damage is going to be diluted over a large area. It's probably even going to be hard to get bird management to work because the damage is going to be so diluted. So you don't have to worry about as much in these high yield years. Okay, I've lost my little controls here. There we go. All right, along these same lines, early ripening blocks have more bird activity and damage. So if you're someone who has some early ripening varieties, you're probably aware that, you know, you become the first stop in the neighborhood where birds can get some food. So they tend to be a very high risk type of situation too. And then also when you've got blocks that have non-crop edges. So if you've got a big field of apples or sweet cherries, often in the middle, you're getting less damage. But if you've got it, you know, smaller blocks that are surrounded by woods or residential areas, you're probably going to get more damage near those edges. And so, you know, this is to illustrate that. Again, in 2012 through 2014, we looked at blocks which had 0 sweet cherry edges. In other words, they were surrounded by other land cover types. And then blocks that were adjacent, they had 1 sweet cherry edge adjacent to another sweet cherry block, or blocks that had 2 sweet cherry edges. And what you can see is that in every case, when you've got these isolated blocks without other crops near or other areas of the crop nearby, you get the highest damage in each of these years. And you get less damage the more the block is surrounded by the same type of crop. Okay, so another general principle I would say is that the more resources that are available for birds, the more damage you are going to get. So some of these resources, these are the types of resources that you might have on your farm that are going to attract birds. So one thing might be cover from predators. So if you have some woodlot or some forest, you know, this is potentially going to be provide roosting sites for them or staging areas from which they are going to enter your crop when they want something to eat. Streamside vegetation may be used the same way. Attractive roosting sites. Again, if you've got some woods nearby. Also, if you have accessible grain or accessible water. So if you have some livestock, those types of things are also going to be attractive to birds. So any of these things may, you know, draw birds to certain areas of your farm. And here's one I just wanted to mention too. So we did find in our previous work that blocks of Honeycrisp apples with wires or cables over them tended to be, you know, have more damage. And so here's a bunch of starlings on one of these cables. And so it gives them a place to perch and makes the crop more accessible. So this is a non-native species. Many of you may be familiar with, but they can be a real problem in fruit growing operations. And they also are the type we worry about because they often are looking for grain. So if you've got a livestock near a fruit field, for example, you can get them moving back and forth and potentially, you know, bringing pathogens and that kind of thing. So starlings are not a great species. So here's some of the bird management strategies we're going to talk about today. One that most of you are probably familiar with are scaring devices. And then we'll talk about barriers, things like netting. And I'll also spend some time, we've done a bit of research in this area on cultural management or increasing natural predators near your farms. I'll also briefly mention deterrent sprays. There's one chemical on the market that's used right now. And I'll briefly mention also lethal control. Okay, so you may be familiar with things like these propane cannons that make a loud sound, and you can also set them to go off randomly. So that's an important part of bird management. If you use some device like this, the more you can make it kind of unpredictable, the more success you're likely to have. So if something just goes off at the same interval all the time, you know, the birds habituate to that. They know what to expect. So if you can impose some random movement or some random sound, that's going to certainly help help you with your bird management. Now, I will mention, you know, and I'm going to mention this a couple times throughout, the more effort you put into things, of course, the more likely you are to succeed in managing the birds. So, you know, we worked with one blueberry grower and they had several of these, and near harvest time, you know, he and his wife and his kid, they would take turns kind of manning these, and he had it set so that he could make them go off at certain times. And they had a little high point among their fields, so they'd be watching the fields, and if a bunch of starlings came in a certain area, they'd set off the cannon over there. So he felt like that worked, but of course it was a lot of labor there to get it to work. Okay, we've also done some work with these tube men, and I would say certain growers really like them. And again, the more effort you put into them, the more likely they are to work. And that means when I say, you know, moving them around every couple of days. You can set them on different speeds. So you can set them, you know, low, medium, or high. And if they're in the lower medium range, then they'll flop over more and they'll have a lot more kind of unpredictable movement. If you have it on high, they're just going to be kind of always up in the air like this. So this is a, you know, a scare tactic again. And I do have these data. So these were, we set them up, these tube men, in pairs of blueberry fields. And we assessed whether the berries lost per cane per day were different in the blocks that had tube men versus the ones that did not, the controls. And what you can see is that we had pretty variable results. So, you know, when you look at the statistics of it, there was not quite a statistically significant difference between the blocks with tube men and the controls, though there was a trend in the direction we expected. So you can see in a number of these blocks, where are they? For example, this block, the berries lost were a lot higher in the control. Same thing here, same thing here. But there were some blocks where there weren't as big differences, okay? Or where even the tube men block had more loss. So in other words, you know, this isn't a surefire technique. You're going to have to put some effort into it, and it seems to vary from place to place. And there are some things to consider with we call them air dancers or tube men. One is a power source, so you definitely need that nearby. We did it with generators one year, and you can imagine that was a lot of work and a lot of fuel. Also, you're not supposed to run them in big rainstorms. You know, if there's a few drops, you can run them, but not when there's torrential rain. And then, you know, we did find also that some of the growers, they said their dogs really didn't like these. So the family dog kind of went nuts when this thing was around. So that's an interesting thing you might want to consider. And then I'll also just throw in that some, you know, like one or two of the vineyards we worked with in New York, they had these marketing campaigns around like the tube men, like naming the tube men or something like that. So just an interesting thing to throw out that you might think about. And also we were interested in the idea, though we never tested it, if dogs were so wary of them, in some cases, would they be good for deer management? You know, which you might have to run them at night if deer are a problem for you, but that's just something to think about. All right, so another type of scare device that's getting, it's getting more attention, though I would say it's not really there yet, are using certain types of drones to try and protect your fields. And of course, drones are being used for other parts of agriculture, precision agriculture and that kind of thing. So this was a study we did in 2018 in sweet cherry fields. And we worked in orchards up in northern Michigan and took observations in our cherry ripening period, the mid-June through mid-July period. And we had quite a rigorous protocol. So here is one of our older sweet cherry orchards. And we used two flight patterns. One was kind of a lawnmower where the drone just went side to side over the block. And then one we had a circular flight pattern was where it was just flying in a circle around the observation area. And we had about 50 meters squared observation area. So while the drone was flying, and also while it wasn't flying, one of our assistants, Naomi Barnes, she would be there observing the birds that were in the block. Okay, so here's our colleagues, and they are going out there with the drone to get it started. Here's Naomi, who's going to be doing the observations. All right, so they're getting it going. And here's how we sampled. We had a pre-drone period where Naomi observed for birds. So this was 15 minutes. Then we observed for birds when the drone was flying over the field. And then we had a post-drone period. Again, no drone. And then we had a break. So you had these 4 15-minute periods. That was an hour. And then we called that one sampling round. Then we had up to 6 sampling rounds in a day. And then we used the first flight pattern, the lawnmower, and then the second time we would use the circular flight pattern. And in addition to the drone, we, Fred and Bill, they installed Cooper's Hawk calls on the drone. So they would be made while the drone was flying overhead. And the Cooper's Hawk, if you're not familiar with it, is a bird that specializes on eating other birds. So it's a real predator on birds. And we hoped that would make the fruit-eating birds a little more fearful. Okay, so here's Naomi watching during these different periods. And here you can see the drone is up here. Okay, so we had a couple of predictions. One is that we'd see fewer of the fruit-eating birds during the periods when the drone was flying overhead compared to those pre-drone periods. And then we also predicted that in observation periods later in the day, we'd get fewer birds because they would have, seen that this drone was around and be less likely to. Okay, and so here's what we found. And I would say, these are like the data we wanted from every block. So here's the number of fruit-eating birds that were observed. And what we wanted was during this drone period, when the drone was flying overhead, we'd have fewer birds than during the pre-drone or the post-drone period. And you can see that happen through 3 sampling rounds here. Like, look at these data. These are just great and what we wanted to see in all the blocks. Unfortunately, we didn't see that on all the blocks. It was pretty variable. So here are some less promising data. The first round in this block B, yeah, we got it looked like a response, fewer fruit-eating birds when the drone, but then, in the second round, we're getting more birds during the drone period. And then it's kind of intermediate here. So, what we can say from this preliminary study that we did was that there was really mixed evidence. We couldn't say there was a consistent pattern all the time, that there were fewer birds during the drone periods. And we did not see strong evidence that the birds decreased in periods later in the day either. So it certainly would be better to get data from more sites. And also people are playing around now with different drone types, like is a fixed wing drone better than some kind of drone with rotors, for example. And there was a paper published recently saying that, yes, the fixed wing or the ones that look more like predatory birds are probably going to be more effective than rotor types of deals. And one thing to think about is, if we're not getting the results we see, it could be that a lot of the birds are accustomed to lots of activity in the field. So there's pruning going on, there's spraying, maybe there's mowing going on. So it's possible they're not as bothered by the drone as birds who are naive to lots of activity might be. So I would say, and also, there's some other issues, like someone needs to fly the drone. And also you've got wind and rain limitations. You can't fly on some days. So, I mean, in the future, what we'd love to see, is some drone that can kind of sit on a pod and then has sensors and it senses birds moving into a field. And then it can get itself off the pod and go chase them away and then get itself back on the pod. So I think that is what our future ideal situation would be for drones, but we're not there yet. Okay, so I am going to mention another thing that's been getting some press in the last few years, and that's what are called laser scarecrows. By some researchers are essentially lasers. And so you may have heard about lasers being used for bird management. And I would say there have been a number of studies over the years that showed that it really varied a lot by species, how much they seem to be affected by lasers. So some studies showed like starlings and brown-headed cowbirds, they weren't affected at all. They didn't seem to be bothered by lasers at all. Now, other studies with pigeons and mallard ducks showed that they had temporary responses. So they were less likely to use an area when the lasers were there. And then finally, Canada geese in one study were strongly deterred by lasers. So big differences between species. And I'll also mention all those studies were done at night, when you might expect the lasers would be more conspicuous. Now, Rebecca Brown, she's a researcher at the University of Rhode Island. I'm thinking, she has this little YouTube you could take a look at. She's been working on this laser scarecrow idea. Essentially, there's a laser light in here that moves around randomly. So you can see it's a pretty simple apparatus, and it moves back and forth over the field. You can see they did some tests in sweet corn here. And some of the potential benefits of this is that, it doesn't make a sound. So it's not like a propane cannon that might annoy your neighbors. It's not a lot of work like netting. And it's got this random component to it. And it's moving around. So unlike scare balloons you may have seen. And it also can operate on solar panels. So you don't need a power source like that's as strong as you would for the air dancers. And then it also is not a pesticide application with all that entails, or a deterrent application. Okay, so do they work? Now, her preliminary work suggested that they did seem to have some deterrent effect in sweet corn. The jury was really still out from some tests in blueberries. And to my knowledge, there's no tests yet in tree fruits. But you might keep your ears open because this does seem to be a technique that's getting some attention these days. And you can look up her website. She did have a way you could, instructions, you could make your own laser scarecrow, or she did have some kits that she was selling, in the last couple of years. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but that's a potential resource. Okay, and this I'm just going to mention as kind of a home remedy. I mean, it's not the type of thing that's been tested and replicated way that I know of, but some people think effigies work pretty well. And so this was an extension agent here at Michigan State. He felt that effigies, crow effigies that he put in melons and tomatoes worked pretty well to keep birds away from a pretty limited area. He said there was certainly a distance effect. So the further you got away, it wouldn't work. But so, something to keep in mind. Again, a home remedy. Okay, so with any of these scare deterrents, birds are going to habituate. They're pretty smart, actually. So using multiple deterrents, getting them going early in the growing season before the birds have settled into your block is really better. It's really hard once they've established that they like to be there. And moving them around frequently should enhance their effectiveness in deterring birds. All right, I'll mention netting briefly. So here's netting on some blueberries. And I would say just a couple things to be aware of. And, a lot of people, as you saw in one of the first slides there, a lot of growers consider netting to be quite an effective technique for protection from birds. But you do have to be sure that there's not a gap between the netting and the ground, because easily then birds get up into the netting, and then you've really got a problem because they're in there eating fruit and then they can't get out. And so you might end up with dead birds and pretty unpleasant. So I would say make sure the netting goes all the way to the end of the, goes all the way to the ground. And it's also better if it doesn't lay on the bushes. I mean, this is not ideal right here because the birds can come up on the netting and they can just eat the berries through the netting. So ideally, what you'd want is something like it on a frame. Okay, so then you don't get the net laying right on the crop and it's going all the way down to the ground here. All right, let me mention this cultural management practice. of attracting natural predators. And so this is a small falcon, the smallest in North America. It's known as the American kestrel. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. This is the male. There's also the females are rustier than the males here, but you can see they're really attractive. And we've been experimenting for the last, 8 or 10 years or so, putting up kestrel boxes in blueberry and sweet cherry orchards in Michigan. So here's a couple of my grad students getting that going. And then we collected a lot of data about, when they were nesting. My grad student, Megan, she was really good with technology, and she devised all these contraptions so that she could look in the box from down here. She has a little screen and some cables and a 40-pound boat battery in here. In Michigan, we're really into boat batteries and using them for various things. So anyway, that's how we collected some of the data. We got wonderful occupancy of the boxes in our northern Michigan site. So here's a clutch of eggs. Then they would hatch, of course, and be fed by their parents. And what we did was we also put cameras in the boxes and near the boxes, so we could record the types of prey they were bringing in. So here's some insect prey, some of the types of insect prey they bring in. They also eat a lot of voles. So even though I'm focusing on bird management, they eat a lot of voles, even more than birds, and so that can be really helpful. And then also they eat birds. All right, so we find bird parts in their boxes. So you can see they have a very wide diet, and a lot of the species they do eat are pest species. Okay, and so it takes them about, the eggs are in the box about a month, and then the nestlings are in the box about a month. So for 2 solid months, you've really got adults staying close to these boxes. And then for about 2 to 3 weeks after the birds leave the box, they're also in the area. So one of my previous grad students in 2015 and 16 did these pest bird surveys. So she was looking for pest birds in blocks which had kestrels and which did not have kestrels. And then she looked at the data and found that here's data from sweet cherry orchards, and here's data from tart cherry orchards. The pink boxes are those blocks which didn't have kestrel boxes, and the blue ones are the ones that did. And the bottom line is that there was significantly lower numbers of fruit-eating birds in the blocks which had active kestrel nesting attempts in both the sweet and tart cherries. So that's exactly the result we wanted. It seemed like they were deterring the fruit-eating birds. So this is where those data were coming from. And it really seemed like this was like perfect kestrel habitat up here, because we'd put up 8 or 10 boxes a season, 9 of them would be occupied, very high occupancy. And so we thought, well, this is great. Let's put some of these boxes down here in blueberry land, we called it. This is a real heavy blueberry production region in Michigan. And we found some interesting results. So in the blueberry region, we got much less occupancy of the boxes. Like 30% of our boxes were occupied in 2016, 29% in 2018. And this was much lower than our sweet cherry occupancy, 100%, 88%, 89%. And so I'm showing you these data to say, I don't know what would happen in your part of the world. It seems like it's really geographically specific how well the kestrels take to any boxes that you put up. This is kind of perfect habitat for kestrels in a box. There's a cherry orchard here, all this open land. They really like to hunt in short grass. So this is really nice habitat. But here's some issues to consider if you want to put up kestrel boxes and try to attract kestrels. First of all, kestrels and rodenticides do not mix. So you want to be sure that you're not using rodenticides when they're around. And also, they will be effective based on your crop. So for example, if you've got wine grapes that are ripening in the fall, kestrels are not going to be helpful because they're nesting in May, June, and July. All right, if you've got sweet cherries nesting in these periods, or blueberries or something like that, then they're more likely, to overlap your crop ripening, and then they're most likely to be helpful. And I do have to mention too, starlings, this bird that's come up before in this presentation. So it's this non-native species that will often use kestrel boxes. And I think this is potentially one issue in our western blueberry growing region where we had low kestrel occupancy. There were lots and lots of starlings down there in our boxes. Up in our northern Michigan region, almost none. So it's really interesting, the geographic variability in the box occupancy, both by the kestrels and by this other species that we don't want. And here's a picture of the kestrel again, checking out a box. One thing I'll mention just briefly here is if you do anything like put up nest boxes for raptors, people in California are putting up, growers are putting up boxes for barn owls because they eat lots of mammals. You know, a colleague of mine did some focus group studies looking at how consumers think about these type of bird management strategies. And the bottom line is that they're very favorably disposed to these types of strategies. So if you do it, you know, so here's an example. My colleagues did some kind of choice experiments with people, asking them questions. And the bottom line is that people said they were willing to pay more for fruit produced with these types of techniques like predator nest boxes or falconry that they saw as kind of mimicking natural processes. They were willing to pay more for apples and grapes compared to like this reference bird management technique, which would be maybe shooting a few birds and just leaving the rest and hoping they'd be scared away. But so people preferred those types of techniques, and it was even on the same level of preference as fruit of local origin. You know, people like, a lot of people tend to like local origin fruits, same level of interest. So if you do this type of thing, put up predator nest boxes, we do encourage people to put it on your website or let consumers know what you're doing, because there's some potential marketing advantages there. And so this, I think this is a barn owl box up. Yeah, well, maybe barn owl looks pretty big for a kestrel. So anyway, an example of a grower advertising on their website about this. All right, I said I would briefly mention there are some products on the market that are deterrent chemicals, and they have a chemical known as methylantranilate, which is the active ingredient. What it does is it irritates the bills of birds, it irritates their nerves. And so if you spray it on the crops, it's supposed to deter birds. And now we tried this in some blueberry blocks where the growers sprayed half the block. We used a product called Avian control, and then they kept the other half unsprayed. And this is a pretty small sample size, 4 pairs of blocks. But what you can see is that we didn't really see a consistent effect here. I mean, there's a couple of blocks that they had lower bird damage compared to the halves of the blocks without it, the chemical, but then here, you know, we're not really seeing a pattern. So I would say, you know, it's hard to say that you're going to see consistent deterrence with this. I mean, one of the issues is it's going to be rained off, so you'd need to reapply it. But so just, you know, some data we've collected along those lines. Okay, some other strategies I'll just mention. One is lethal control. So that's, you know, shooting some birds. And it turns out this isn't typically as effective as you might think it would be. So there've been some studies, and it just, you know, you do kill some birds at that time period, but you're not necessarily going to get long-term control here. And then there's also the issues with potentially getting some contamination in your crops and things of that nature. So, you know, probably it's not going to work that well for you. Another thing that's getting some attention is something called a sonic net. And this is not really a net. What it is it's these recording, broadcasting devices that are put out, and they broadcast the sound, which birds apparently don't like the frequency of. So it's supposed to interfere with their communication channels and deter them. And I would say this is still being tested too. There were some preliminary results that were quite promising at an airfield, showing that these could deter some birds. But so you might keep your ears open about this type of thing. Okay, so I did want to briefly mention, since Sometimes you want to keep birds out of buildings. So how do you do that? I've been primarily talking about birds out in fields and that kind of thing. So again, it's kind of the thing where you put more effort into it, the more success you're going to have. Excuse me. But and some of it's kind of tedious types of work. But one is keeping food resources as inaccessible as possible. So keeping grains stored if you can, or covered, and then keeping water resources inaccessible. So this might mean something like the water in tanks for wild livestock. You know, it should be kind of low enough that birds can't sit on the rim and reach down and try to get the water. But you also kind of want it high enough that they can't stand in the water and get it. So, you know, trying to keep those inaccessible. Another thing is to block the entryways to the buildings, maybe using these plastic strips. I'll show a picture of it in a minute. And then you can also do things like netting around potential perch sites, like in the rafters, for example. Again, this would be a substantial amount of work. So you'd have to think about whether the cost benefit analysis works for you. And I've also, you know, heard providing catwalks for cats to make sure that they have access to these areas where birds might be nesting can be useful. One sec here. Oh, okay, so these are the plastic strips I'm talking about. You know, and going along with that, any kind of holes that you can plug up, any way to deter entry into your buildings is going to help with your bird management issues. Okay, I did want to talk briefly too about some legal considerations. And so many of you may be aware that most migratory birds, and I will say when they say migratory birds, it really is almost all birds in North America. I mean, there's a few species that aren't protected, but most birds are protected under this Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And this includes Canada geese, sandhill cranes, you got some here, gulls, hawks, and waterfowl. So that means you can't just go out and get rid of them. I mean, there are a few exceptions here, but so keep in mind, you want to be in compliance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And if you do want to kill some protected species like the cedar waxwings here, which are big fruit eaters, you do need to get a depredation permit from a USDA Wildlife Services office. And you can do that. Now, you know, here's technically what it says. No federal permits required to scare or herd depredating migratory birds except endangered or threatened species or bald or golden eagles. In other words, if they're about to, you know, get into your crop, you can scare them away. And you also, if you want to control, you know, lethally a few species, you can do that, like red-winged blackbirds, cowbirds, grackles, and crows, when it says they're committing or about to commit depredations on agricultural crops. So these are a lot of the kind of a lot of people would put them all in the category of blackbirds right here. Now, I would suggest that you check state regulations because these are just the federal regulations here. Okay, so here are some take-home points from the presentation here. I would say each farm's unique and it should be assessed for risk factors for bird damage. So those things I mentioned early on, you know, do you have resources that birds would be attracted to? Do you have cables over your fields? Do you have woody vegetation that they might like? All those types of things. What's the arrangement of your blocks? Are your blocks isolated and surrounded by woodlots? And then consider when and where the crop is limited or small. And that's when you might predict percent bird damage is going to be high. So in low yield years, when you've got early ripening varieties, edges of the blocks we mentioned, anywhere where you've got just a small amount of crop, it may be particularly susceptible to bird damage. You want to decrease the resources for the detrimental birds. And then also it's helpful to use multiple management strategies and not just depend on one or two things. You want to have a lot of tools in your toolkit. And then you can also increase resources for beneficial predators, as I talked about. So for example, potentially you want to put up bird boxes for predators and see if you can draw them in. And again, remember, this is going to vary depending on where you are, how successful you are in getting the bird species you want, and how much management you're going to have to do. So for example, in our sweet cherry For our sweet cherry growers in northern Michigan, we tell them to put up kestrel boxes. You know, it's a great tool in the toolkit. But for western Michigan blueberry growers, it's much more of a mixed bag because you're going to have to look out for starlings and remove their nests if they get in there. And it may not be worth that amount of management to you. Okay. So I wanted to thank a lot of the researchers that have been involved in the work that I just presented today. It's taken place over a number of years. We had a couple of different funding sources I'll mention. So lots of students and researchers. And here's some of the funding sources we had from the USDA, the Specialty Crop Research Initiative, National Science Foundation has funded some of our work, and various agricultural groups in Michigan, and then of course the many growers who participated in our surveys and let us work in their blocks. So we have lots of thank yous and gratitude to all of them. And I'd be happy to take questions now, Ariel, if that sounds good.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you so much. I'm going to close your slides and bring up my last slides while we open up the time for questions. All right. And Catherine, can you see the chat as well?
Oh, I can see the chat. Yes, here.
I don't see any questions quite yet. That was really great information. I'm so grateful that you were able to share all of that with us.
Yeah, that would be, I always like to, you know, we've gotten resources, so we want to spread the information around as much as we can. You're welcome. Those of you who are saying thank you, I appreciate it.
All right, well, we'll give them a chance to think of their questions as I go through these last closing points of the webinar today. So like I mentioned, this was the last in our four-part series this year. They are all going to be recorded and posted for later viewing on our University of Idaho Extension website and also our Produce Safety YouTube page. If you've missed them, we had Effective Worker Trainings Part 1. We had a replay from 2021, which was managing mostly rodent pests in enclosed buildings. Then we had Effective Worker Training Part 2, and then we had today's Strategies for Avian Pest Management, which is really, really excellent. And we also have our pre-recorded from the years past webinars also on our website. So I know that some of you are anxious to receive your ISDA pesticide licensing credit for attending today. So in the chat, I need you to go into the chat, and then if you're asking questions, you can make those available to everyone. But if you don't have a question and you're just typing in to get your credit, choose send to hosts and panelists, and then type your first and last name, your ISDA pesticide license number, and your email and phone number, and we can get those credits processed. So please do that in the chat, and I will capture that and get your credits sent out to you. And I'm really impressed, Catherine. You kept that right to the hour mark, and there was so much information there.
And I'll also mention, if anyone's particularly interested, somehow, Ariel, I'll have to get you my contact information. So we have a sheet that describes the characteristics of a kestrel nest box, if you want to put it up, like, you know, what direction it should face and how tall it should be and that kind of thing. So yeah, people should feel free to email me and I can send them something along those lines.
Great, that would be wonderful. And just to remind you all, you need to type in your name, your email, your license number, and your phone number. And if you're hitting enter to go to the next line, that's going to send your chat. So just kind of put a space bar and write your license number, a space bar, your email, and your phone number. That would be really great. You know, we have a program in several parts of Idaho where Fish and Game will provide owl boxes, but kestrel boxes would be really neat too. I like that idea. Maybe we can include that that link in the follow-up email. All right. Well, we're getting everyone giving us their info. Maybe while we're just waiting for that, Catherine, what is kind of your future research looking like? What are you looking into next?
Well, we're really interested in trying to look at pest management issues in high density. High density apples in particular and sweet cherries are getting a little traction in Michigan. But we're trying to get some funding to see whether, pest levels differ in high density compared to conventional grown, and what kinds of management strategies you can use. So insect pests as well as bird pests. And it's interesting, there doesn't seem to have been as much research as I would have expected on that, given that it's a growing trend.
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of high density apple orchards here in our area. So
Oh.
that would be very valuable to us too. All right, well, I'm going to stay on and let everyone keep giving me their information. But I also want to remind you that we do have a survey for today. Really help us to know if we're on the right track. I'll remind you that all of these webinars were based on either the observations by our inspectors of places where we could all do better, or they were recommended to us through our Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings when we ask, what else do you need help with related to food safety on your farm? So these webinars are really meant to be responsive to you as growers and to help you to prepare for a better inspection and also to be more effective and economically successful growers. So thank you for joining us, and yeah, please continue to put your information into the chat, and please click this link or use your phone to highlight that QR code, and we can put that evaluation data to work for next year. So I'll put that link in the chat. And we really appreciate you joining us for this season of the produce safety webinars. And Catherine, thank you so much again. It was really a pleasure to meet you and to be able to benefit from your years of research and expertise.
Okay, so I'll sign off then, and Aria, I'll be in touch with my contact info.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, talk to you later.
Bye.